And the fact is that they're winning and you guys aren't.
Yeah, if you guys ever get to reading Gulag Archipelago, I'm going to force myself into your club.
It's not fiction, though, bro. Come on.
Yeah, no, good point.
I wish it was. I wish it didn't go down like that.
We all wish it was, yeah.
If I was there, it wouldn't have gone down like that. No, you should come on as a guest, Vaden. You should pick out like a short story or something that you love or that you have something interesting to say about and come on and guest. That'd be dope.
Or maybe if we do Lolita, we should have Vaden on.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about Lolita. I love Lolita.
Creepy.
Creepy.
Yeah, Ben warned me you were creepy. Yeah. You took exactly the wrong message away from Lolita.
You just have to let him talk for long enough. It starts coming out.
It's that nubile face of his, just brings out the Humbert in me.
Dude, I can't wait to hear Cam talk about Lolita because he loves to, give him just enough rope to hang himself. So I'm sure he's going to, tell on him. He tells on himself like every book club in all kinds of revealing ways. Yeah, should we get into it?
Yeah, I can kick things off. So we have Mr. Rich here, who is Ben's second podcast host. I'm not bothered by it. That's fine. That doesn't hurt me at all. And I guess he had some comments / criticism / questions about the Bayesian nonsense that we were spewing, or the anti-Bayesian nonsense that we were spewing on the last episode with regards to our criticisms of Scott Alexander's piece in Continued Defense of Non-Frequentist Probabilities. And I think we're just going to have a freewheeling conversation where neither Ben nor myself know what exactly Rich wants to talk about, but we are an open book and let's get into it. So, Mr. Rich, welcome to Increments.
Thank you. It's good to be here. This is exciting. I'm scared. I'm excited. I'm aroused. It's confusing, but
Can I just say one thing for the listeners, which is I didn't realize that Rich was like a published freaking author. I just was Googling his name. And I'm like, my God, this motherfucker has written a book. And so I don't know if you want to say just like one or two sentences of introduction about who you are and what you've done. And
This published author is going to try and argue about statistics with a fucking machine learning PhD. And another guy who's getting his PhD in statistics and machine learning. So, yeah, I'm the one with the authority here. I won't say too much about my own, what I'm up to or my background, but I will perhaps just mention my sort of intellectual journey to date, a bit of a gloss on that, which could be useful to see where I'm coming from in this conversation, which, to be clear, I don't want to be a debate. I think it's more going to be hopefully a exploration or in a synthesis. I started out as a teenage atheist, a smug teenage atheist, as I'm sure is perhaps relatable to you guys. Dawkins was my guy out of the four horsemen. He was my number one.
Nice.
And then I needed to find like new ways to feel superior to other people. So I got into the behavioral finance stuff, big Kahneman, Tversky fan, the cognitive biases literature. And that led quite smoothly into the rationalist community, which also early on, I think, had a big focus on overcoming bias, which was like literally the name of one of their main blogs. And then the other one is called Less Wrong, which I was a keen reader of. I read a lot of stuff by Eliezer Yudkowsky and Scott Alexander, the guy whose post you were critiquing in the last episode. Yeah, and I found a lot of that material really useful and interesting, and it's had a big impact on me. I never actually became a card-carrying member of the rationalist community for various reasons. So I posted on Less Wrong a bit. I read their stuff a lot, but I sort of kept myself a little distance from it. And part of the reason for that was I was more compelled by the effective altruism sort of offshoot of rationality, where I think their praxis is better, and also maybe their epistemology is a little better as well. So I got more closely involved in that, and I was running some EA meetups in my home city of Auckland, New Zealand. And then as it happened, I went to a EA retreat for New Zealand in the national retreat in February 2023. And I met our mutual friend Cam, shout out to Cam, who kept banging on about this guy called David Deutsch. So yeah, that just sent me down this whole new rabbit hole. I read Beginning of Infinity. I found, or Cam told me about your podcast in the Discord, and I've been listening to a bunch of that. I've just started getting into Bruce Nielsen's stuff, and basically it's been incredibly sort of generative for me and feels like a new intellectual world opening up before me. I've made some good progress in the last 15 months or whatever it's been, and I think you guys have made some extremely compelling arguments against certain elements of the Bayesian rationalist community and of the EA community, like with regards to long-termism and doing expected value calculations with extremely tenuous inputs and things of that nature. I've been won over to that and to the central premise of critical rationalism around explanations being the fundamental driver of new knowledge. So here I am now. I've still got like lingering affection for the Bayesian rationalists, and I have noticed in your podcast episodes that you guys kind of have you get like a hate boner for the rationalists and for the EA people quite often. And so mostly you, Vaden.
Oh, me? That doesn't sound right. No, that doesn't sound like me. Yeah. Oh, fair. Yeah.
Benny's somewhat more chill, but I think basically sometimes you throw in arguments that are, I would argue, weak or unnecessary on top of your very good arguments.
Nice.
In other cases, you don't fully flesh out your arguments that are good, but that perhaps that maybe they're obvious to you, but they wouldn't necessarily be obvious to someone coming from the other school.
Beautiful.
And then finally, I think there are some arguments that you're probably aware of, but you just might not think to mention, that sort of elements of Bayesian style rationality that are actually sort of admirable or in some way, or true in some way, even if they're not pragmatically very useful. Mm-hmm. So what I'd love to do in this conversation is, I'm not going to debate you. I agree with almost everything that you said in that episode, but I'd like to explore what the least bad elements of Bayesian rationalism are, and with the idea that if there's someone listening who comes from that camp, then perhaps they could understand what it is about critical rationalism that you guys are always banging on about. And then from the other point of view, obviously your audience is mostly crit rats. Perhaps they can get a better understanding or a fuller understanding of where the Bayesian style stuff can be useful and where perhaps it does point at some deep truth about reality. Yeah, so that's my spiel. Yeah, so basically I've got a list of things that I do agree with that we don't need to litigate that I could go through, and then some areas where I'd probably want to push back, some things I'm confused about. So how would you like to do it?
I think we should just get right to the pushback. Maybe I should say a few complimentary words about Less Wrong and EA just to correct any misimpression that I hate them or anything. Of course I don't. And of course I have sometimes a little bit too much fun poking fun. But let's be clear. So there's a lot of amazing things that Less Wrong and EA community have done that I've talked about before in regards to altruism and thinking more rationally about charitable giving. All that is great. With regards to Less Wrong, his rationality from A to Z had a big influence on me when I was younger, and separating out the Bayesian stuff, which we'll obviously talk about. There's just a lot of great common sense, or maybe not so common sense, wisdom about all sorts of things. So Yudkowsky obviously doesn't only talk about Bayes. He talks about all sorts of aspects of science, and I've learned a lot from him. With regards to maybe like the strongest steelman defense I can make of Bayesian epistemology. So often when people say, what's your steelman? I'll give the answer of Bayesian statistics is great and good. But let's maybe exclude that one as a potential steelman for now. And let's just talk about steelmanning Bayesian rationalism. And there I just want to talk about Julia Galef. I think she's fantastic. And I think that she essentially takes the equations and uses it as a metaphor for being just an open-minded person who listens to arguments from all different sides, isn't too dogmatically attached to any one particular view. She has a nice metaphor about, say, snowflakes of evidence, which directly comes out of thinking about the world probabilistically. And I think it's a great heuristic that maybe if you hear a bunch of weak arguments from a bunch of different sources, maybe you shouldn't just dismiss them all because they're individually weak. Maybe you should aggregate them and see if there is actually they're there. And so in terms of the best steelman of Bayesian rationalism and rationality, I would want to point to Galef, because I think she's quite impressive. Notably, she doesn't take the equation too seriously, and I haven't heard her talk too much about quantifying her beliefs with precise numerical estimates. Maybe she does have some of that, and sometimes that's used as a pedagogical example. But in terms of a lot of the stuff that she puts out in her public writings and stuff, I think 99% of it, I'll be saying percentages sometimes, but
what?
Colloquially, I know the vast majority of it is great and educational, and I think that the critical rationalist community could learn a lot from that, because I think that there's way too much dogmatism, myself included. I'm not exempt from that critique. I'm very dogmatic as well, and also the norms that the lesser-known community has cultivated, I think, are exceptional. I think that part of that might have to do with the fact that a lot of the people there are on the spectrum and like to write a lot of blogs, and that's not a bad thing. But I think that the critical rationalist world could learn a lot from that too. So maybe just to balance some of the arguably lot of cheap shots that I do like to take sometimes, in a more calm and sober mind, I do hold them in high regard in many different instances. So just want to maybe balance that out a bit.
Yeah, nice. It's good to actually just sort of hear that and get a fuller sense of the perspective you're coming from. Yeah, I suspect we may end up not even disagreeing about very much, because what you just said is literally like one of the points I was going to raise.
Oh, nice.
But before we get there, Benny, do you want to do like an opening spiel? Is there anything that you want to state up?
Yeah, I don't have much to add to Vaden's spiel. I mean, I'm more sympathetic to EA in general. So, I'm just more sympathetic to the core idea of having morality be a pretty key part of your life and thinking hard about how to help others as effectively as possible. And I think, that is the core idea of EA, regardless of whether you think they've sort of gone off the rails under the influence of their own logic in recent years. But I think their core insights to just try and think hard and separate doing good in the world from having warm fuzzies about doing good in the world is one of the most powerful altruistic insights of the past ever, basically, because I think we've been guided by warm fuzzies and tribal thinking, et cetera, for as long as humanity's been around, essentially. So to start decoupling those aspects of our thinking has been incredibly powerful. And then with respect to sort of Bayesian rationality and EA, I mean, I think, I keep sort of harping on in the podcast and in writing about how much I admire sort of the kind of thinking and the group dynamics that someone like Scott Alexander has been able to foster on his blog. And I'm not sure exactly where that comes from. Vaden alludes to maybe some autistic type tendencies, but I think you probably could trace the sort of epistemic humility with which they approach problems to Bayesian rationality fairly directly, perhaps instrumentally. So that the numbers themselves they're putting on all their beliefs and whatnot aren't as important as simply the recognition that they could be wrong, right? So that they've cultivated this norm where it would be absurd to say, well, I believe this with 100%, or I'm 100% certain, I'm 100% confident about such a proposition. And as soon as you make that move, now to my lights, you're sort of start assigning arbitrary numbers to propositions, and you can get carried away with the sort of arithmetic you're willing to do with those numbers. But the positive is that now you've recognized for yourself and signaled to others that you could be wrong. So it's sort of this permanent reminder that, I'm not 100% certain about this. So if someone comes up to me with an opposite argument, they could be right. And so it's like a permanent reminder that you've given yourself of your own fallibility. And that, those are the sorts of insights that why I like Popper so much and why I was so drawn to his sort of epistemology, right? He sort of he makes the same moves, but just doesn't put numbers on it. And so I think the numbers game can be dangerous for all the reasons we've given so far, but sort of that consistent reminder, psychological reminder that you're not fallible is super important. And I think probably is what gives the community such a good handle on being epistemically open and ability to change their mind and stuff. And I've never met a community that's simultaneously more fun to argue with because they're also nice and open and polite, and is willing to change their mind about fairly substantive issues, right? Perhaps not as much as Vaden would like, but much more so than, say, the Deutschian community. I say that as if it's a monolith, but obviously a community is just the aggregate of the members. But I do think in general, perhaps the people who are hardcore Deutsch fans are more dogmatic for sure than EAs. And perhaps that has something to do with Bayesianism itself. So remains to be seen a bit, but Deutschians, I know Deutsch doesn't like that term, but certainly there is a circle of Deutschians who deserve that sort of name. They have a lot to learn, I think, from the way the EA community and the rationality communities comport themselves.
Boys, you're stealing all my talking points. Come on.
All right, and now it's a wrap. Thanks for coming on, Rich.
No, that's nice. That was. I agree with all of that, and I did want to bring that up as sort of the pop Bayesian defense. I'll talk about it a bit more later, just to slightly build on what you guys said. But so just to continue the love fest for a minute, I'm going to very quickly rattle off all the things with which the criticisms of Bayesianism, which I agree with you guys on, and which I'm not going to try and defend, and also with the caveat that I am not a big Bayes guy. I've used Bayes' theorem literally once in my entire life, and I fucked it up because I got the numbers wrong. And someone who was reviewing it had to point out that I'd actually calculated it wrong. So they're not sending their best, okay? I'm just some guy. But yeah, okay, so here are the criticisms that I agree with very quickly. So, it's super annoying to use 50% probability of XYZ in the scenario in which you quite literally have a flat prior, i.e. you have one bit of information or 0 bits of information, and 50% probability in the scenario in which you're a subject matter expert and you have a really good predictive model that's validated by lots of data and backtesting. And to present those as being the same thing is batshit crazy. And I think Scott's just it's strange that Scott is, to the extent he's not willing to acknowledge that, I think he's wrong about that. So we should use different terminology like subjective, we should say probability and subjective credence or something like that. That's still misleading in the sense that the deep point that Scott was making, I think, is that there is no clean distinction between those two, and you will ultimately end up with some edge cases where you can't actually clearly bucket it between those two things. And that's something I'd like to talk to you guys about later. But just for now, I want to say that usually you can make a clear distinction between them, and it would be much better if the Bayes people were clearer about which type of probability they're talking about. I also think that trying to use Bayes' theorem explicitly is very often going to be the wrong tool for the job. It works very well in certain specific scenarios. A classic thing about what's the base rate of having a disease and what's the false positive rate when you get the diagnosis and this kind of thing. But when you're trying to do highly dimensional problem solving with large set of possible alternative possibilities, it becomes extremely unwieldy to the point of being probably useless. And if anyone wants to see a really funny example of that, there's the Scott post about the lab leak debate. Have you guys read that one?
I'm writing about it. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Oh, great.
I think I tweeted out a screenshot when he just basically is Bayesianism, it's a noble idea to try and weigh literally all the evidence, which is what this what's the name of the organization again, or the company? I forget.
I know. I forgot the name of it now. Yeah, I forgot the name of it.
Yeah, he's this is a great idea. Just quantify literally all the evidence. Why haven't we been doing this? And then he's wait, I know why we've been doing this, because it doesn't work.
Did he actually concede that in the end? Because I thought I got the whole way through. It's called Rootclaim, by the way. And at the end, all the discussion was still the object level question of lab leak versus zoonosis. And I was dude, this is the perfect example of why your obsession with Bayes' theorem is hilariously misguided. Did he actually update in that direction?
Well, there's a big debate on Rootclaim responding to Scott's blog and vice versa, and it's gone back and forth a couple times. I don't know if you guys have seen the Rootclaim response to Scott, but Rootclaim basically makes all of the points that we've made in different circumstances. Sorry to cut you off, but
wait, Rootclaim does, because they're pro Bayesian, that organization
so they're doing Bayes. So I don't know if this is maybe a bit off subject, but the way that they're doing Bayes, I am in favor of it. I think that's the most effective way you could possibly do Bayesian stuff, because they're using Bayes nets. You remember from computer science, I think David Poole worked on Bayesian and stuff. And so when there's data available, they use it. When there's not data, they give a very clean set of arguments as to why they're putting in that number. And so if there is ever an opportunity to use Bayes in the right way, I would claim that they are doing it as well as it's possible to be done. They're
interesting.
They're starting with like, it's a Bayes net. So they actually use Bayes theorem. They use MCMC to come up with the posterior. They're doing it properly. And what was hilarious is when Scott saw that, he's like, I don't understand what these guys are doing. It's because you aren't fucking using Bayes theorem at all. People, it's like, this is how you actually are supposed to use it. So I would defend Rootclaim.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah. Because to my eye, so I only read Scott's version of that post, so I have no idea what Rootclaim itself was doing. To my eye, that post just highlighted one of the many problems for me with Bayesian.
Scott's post, just to clear.
Yeah, reading Scott's post was that you always need a theory for why you're using certain numbers. So Bayesianism has this problem where they'd like to just ground out everything and say, here are the numbers. Now we're going to plug these numbers into whatever calculation we'd like to do, and out will pop our posterior probability. Boom. And in that post, Scott has these funny columns where multiple people did the analyses, and there's orders of magnitude difference on their finals probability, like absurd differences. Like
Yeah. One guy was like, the odds are 500 to 1 that I'm wrong. And the other guy was like, okay, well, the odds are 5 million to 1 that I'm wrong.
And it was like, because when you're using these theories, numbers, like evidence in the real world doesn't come with a number attached. So you need a reason, you need a theory for why a proposition, a certain piece of evidence is assigned a certain number. And then you can always ask, well, what's the evidence for that theory? And so Bayesianism has this problem. I wrote a post about this called like, you need a theory for that theory, right? And the point is it's theories all the way down. Real statistics gets around this by just like that we make modeling assumptions, and then there's not a question of like what number do you assign to this piece of evidence, because we bake that into the assumptions, and then we can argue about the assumptions, but no one's going around pretending that the world just starts throwing numbers at you, and it's obvious what those numbers should be, right? But like Bayesian rationality has this problem where you always have to further justify your numbers, and it's just totally circular. And so that's what I got out of that post, was just like, yeah, you can make this shit pop out however you want.
It's totally worth clicking through Rootclaim. They're impressive in the sense that they basically are doing modeling where they have a nice UI such that you can essentially click every node of the input to the Bayes net. They talk about what sources they're viewed. Like it's as well done as it possibly could be. Notably, they're using Bayes theorem. They're using like MCMC sampling to actually form a posterior. And so it's much closer to modeling, except with a hyper fancy UI on top of it, plus like links to the sources and stuff. So it's like a user-friendly kind of statistical model. That's closer to how you should think about Rootclaim.
So one of the things I was going to raise is that just because using a Bayes theorem is pragmatically not very useful at present doesn't necessarily mean that we couldn't come up with a better way to do it. And I was going to suggest that something like Rootclaim, while I have no knowledge as to the actual specifics of it, it would be still worth trying to come up with better ways of applying it from people who have an understanding of the situations in which it does and doesn't make sense to assign numbers to things, basically. One of the naive mistakes that people do is multiplying probabilities for events that are not independent to one another, right? That's like a classic thing. And I think a lot of Bayes rats possibly make that mistake. I don't know, actually. But anyway, to the extent they do that, that's wrong. And then the other thing, which I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on, is this idea that basically when you are dividing up your probability space, everything needs to be mutually exclusive. But it also needs to fully encompass every possible conceivable outcome, right? And you just can't possibly enumerate every possible reality. And so that's when things start to fall apart, when you have to include a term for like, we're in the simulation and the data's vague, and you have to include a term for the sun can blow up tomorrow, and all the stuff that leads you to the Pascal's mugging, Pascal's wager type situations, the long-termism type situations. It's basically unworkable to it's unworkable to come up with mutually exclusive. There's some technical term for this, but like mutually exclusive, fully enumerative set of possibilities. And is that basically, does that get at your guys' objection as well? Is that a way of characterizing it?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple things to say. The first, I'm not quite sure if you were saying this about Bayes' theorem, but let me just offer a clarification. We've said this before in a previous Patreon episode, but perhaps not in the main episode, which is that Bayes' theorem is not solely the providence of Bayesians. So this depends how far you want to wade into the probability debates, but just using Bayes' theorem is something that any probabilist/statistician will do. So it's not as like if you're using Bayes' theorem, then you're a Bayesian sort of thing. That's false. So Bayes' theorem is used all the time by frequentist statisticians. So Bayesian methods all do rely on Bayes' theorem, but then have a separate interpretation often as this subjective notion of updating your beliefs. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify that. I'm not saying, I don't think you actually contradicted that, but I think there is this mistaken reasoning. And I remember certain comments when I think Vaden posted his first against long-termism piece in the EA server where people were like, what, are you just not going to use Bayes' theorem? It's just a formula. And I was like, yeah, exactly. It's just a formula. You don't have to ascribe this philosophical meaning to it.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just one thing I just wanted to quickly get out there. The second is that, yeah, I think you basically hit the nail on the head with respect to one of my objections for Bayesian rationality, say, which wants to just assign probabilities to everything you could possibly see, think, and observe. The reason statistics and probability are so useful and applicable normally is that they apply in what Savage, who was a Bayesian, an old school Bayesian statistician, called small worlds. So we deliberately simplify the world and we create a model, like a small model, and then we can talk about models that make sense because there's no unknown unknowns. Right. So there's not an infinite number of hypotheses about future physical theories that we need to take into account of our theories because we've deliberately simplified the model. And so now we can work with it mathematically. And then there's just the question of, okay, how well does this model let us approximate reality and do useful things with it, right? So that's why statistics is so powerful, precisely because we make these simplifying assumptions. If you don't make these simplifying assumptions, then yeah, the axioms of probability just don't get off the ground. It makes no fucking sense to start talking about a probability measure over literally everything you could possibly think, every theory that you could possibly observe. Like it's like you couldn't even sit down and try and formalize this. And of course, there's a reason no one's been able to do it because it just doesn't make sense. So even subjective Bayesians, like old school subjective Bayesians, needed to work in like very simplified worlds. This is why applying probability to like what's the probability that relativity is wrong and stuff. I think those kind of applications of probability just don't get off the ground because you're trying to use probability in the chaotic real world and not make any simplifying assumptions. And you can't realistically do that. You're trying to apply it outside of its domain.
Yeah.
So that's just to agree with you basically about everything you just said.
Where we should take this is perhaps whether or not in some deep technical or philosophical sense, that actually would be the correct way to update your beliefs about the world. So the scenario I'm envisioning is something like, it's not exactly Laplace's demon, but something of that nature where imagine you could enumerate all possible states of the world and you could ensure that they were mutually exclusive. It wouldn't necessarily be wrong in that scenario to assign probabilities that add up to 1, which is important, across all of those states and then do the math. And that's like completely unwieldy, completely stupid, will lead you astray. Sure, I agree with all that. But I think the deep philosophical point that the Bayesians make that I don't know if you guys agree with or not, is that in some perhaps narrow technical sense, we have an objective, correct method for deciding how to update our beliefs in the face of new evidence. And in theory, but not in practice, we could actually apply that. And so is it a theoretical versus practical concern, or do you disagree that Bayesianism, Bayes' theorem, is actually a very elegant sort of distillation of not the part of epistemology of where do ideas come from, but the part of epistemology about what do we think is true and how do we decide in which theories to put our beliefs. And, that informs all of our actions, and all kinds of things are downstream of that in a very important way. So why don't you react to that?
So the question is, if we could somehow assign probabilities to all sources of evidence and all hypotheses, then Bayes' theorem would give us the, quote, correct way to update our beliefs under that assumption. Is that right?
Yeah, expressed as a probability.
Yeah, so I say no, not at all, for the simple reason that when people talk about this being a correct way that rational agents will update their beliefs, they're using a sneakily and undiscussed definition of rationality. So they're not talking about rationality in the way that Popper thinks about it or in the way that I think about it. They're talking about it with respect to Cox's theorem and the axioms required for Cox's theorem. So there's a deep circularity with regards to that claim, because the claim is basically saying, if you assume that these axioms are correct and you're willing to define rationality as acting in accordance with these axioms, then yes, it is optimal to use Bayes' theorem in that context. But this is motivated reasoning because Bayes' theorem came first, and then Cox's axioms, which is the source of the tying of Bayes' theorems to rational beliefs in the first place, came second. So they tried to figure out a way to tie the theorem to some notion of perfect rational beliefs. But Cox's theorems, the axioms required for that, just don't map onto human cognition. It's not, so it requires a total ordering of your beliefs, for example. I don't have a total ordering of my beliefs.
I don't quite see why that's relevant, because it's too general a criticism. You could apply that to any theory of behavior. Like, this is the idea that, no?
Well, Popper doesn't have axioms with regards to what rationality is.
So he doesn't have like a decision theory about how a rational agent should behave?
Absolutely not. No. He views rationality as an attitude, just a willingness to listen to your conversation partner and openness to admit that you're wrong. So his definition, quote unquote, of rationality isn't a set of mathematized axioms. It is essentially encapsulated in the statement that you may be right and I may be wrong, and together we'll get closer to truth.
Yeah.
So his definition of rationality does not require axioms. So it doesn't apply to everything.
Okay. Yeah. I worry if this might take us a little far afield, but yeah. So just like pragmatically speaking, how would a Popperian go about making decisions? So let's say, for instance, let's distinguish between two cases where you have very good information and a case where you have very little information to inform that could inform your decision. So actual numbers that you could plug into your equation. So the very good scenario could be you want to give your money to give well-recommended charity, and they've sent out investigators to make sure that people aren't stealing it and that it's going to the farmers who they say it's going to, and then they try to measure the utility in some way that's imperfect but still pretty good. And you can be very confident about, if I give $1 tomorrow, what impact is it likely to have? And I'm guessing that you guys feel confident about putting probabilities on that and not using natural language, right? You could frame it in those terms, and you wouldn't lose any sleep over it.
Sorry, probabilities on what exactly?
Just like a give well estimate, like the probability that your dollar will reduce malaria rates by X, given that you know that your dollar is going to spread anti-malarial bed nets across Africa. And you could,
exactly.
Again, with a bunch of modeling assumptions, make some sort of rough and ready estimate about if you give this amount of money, the probability that you'll reduce malaria rates is that. Is that
so square that with what you just said about Popper, because I don't understand what you're saying. You're making a decision that's directly informed by numbers and some kind of putting a probability on a inherently subjective belief about the world, but for which you have excellent reason and evidence to believe it's true.
Yes. So if I may just take one step back, and then I will promise I'll come back to your example. So the, quote, Popperian way of making decisions is what Deutsch talks about in his chapter on choices in Beginning of Infinity, and what I wrote about in my exchange with Mauricio. If you go into the older, less readable blog posts, it's titled just Bayesian epistemology and critical rationalism. And I describe exactly this thing because Mauricio is asking me for how would a critical rationalist approach decision-making. And quite simply, it's by not using a mathematical lens, but using a evolutionary one. The metaphor is blind variation and selective retention. The blind variation stage is where you generate as many frickin' ideas as you possibly can. And then the selective retention stage is you talk about them with as many people and criticize the living shit out of them until you have one idea standing. Often you won't have one idea standing, often you have multiple, and so you repeat the process. In the case of the malarial bed nets, it just so happens that numbers are the best criticism that is available to you. So thinking about criticism is a superset that will subsume numerical criticism when such numbers are available. And then absolutely you're going to use it. So if I'm playing poker, if I'm in a casino, like I'm obviously going to be to the best of my ability thinking probabilistically because that makes the most sense. It's just that I don't have to always think that way. And that's the major distinction. So when the tool is applicable, absolutely let's use it. When it's not, which is in the vast majority of cases. So if you're deciding which school to go to or which book to write next or which sentence to write next, what you're doing internally is you're trying to think really hard about a bunch of options. And then you're like, well, that's not going to work. That's going to contradict what I said earlier. Oh, this is just not grammatical. And then eventually you come up with something. And then you put it on the page. And then what do? You share it with some friends. And so the decision-making process, not how Popper describes it, but how it actually works, how we actually make decisions, is through idea generation and then removal of those ideas which don't work. And in some very narrow set of circumstances, the ideas and the criticisms are numeric. If we have numbers, then absolutely. I'm not going to trust someone's belief about asteroids if I can go talk to someone who's collected a data set about asteroids, like NASA, for example. So let's absolutely use numbers when they're appropriate, but just when it's not appropriate, let's use other tools.
So that makes sense to me. I don't disagree with that at all, but I think it's still bears on what might be our deep sort of philosophical disagreement, which the way that we put it in the Discord was I said that it's a matter of degree between the wacky long-termism stuff and the highly grounded stuff. And you didn't like that very much.
Oh, the fucking degree, not kind argument. Oh, mamma mia.
Yeah. So basically, my point was similar to what I was saying at the start about they're not technically being a bright line between probability in the sense of the actual fact about what will happen and probability as in someone's highly uninformed subjective credence about whether something will happen. So a way to think, there's lots of examples you could give, but perhaps in the GiveWell instance, you could say, you feel very sure about this enough that it's good enough to use the numbers. What if the data comes from an organization that's not as trustworthy? What if the data could have been, you actually think it's by a dodgy researcher and some of their work has been replicated and some of it hasn't? What if the numbers were photocopied several times and some of the digits got smudged? Like basically, you could take it to such a point where you still have some numbers, but you need to add in some other sort of terms for various levels of uncertainty. And there's no exact point at which you'd say, oh, now Bayesianism is really stupid or expected value calculation is really stupid, and now it makes total sense. It's just a framework that it works obviously in some scenarios and doesn't work obviously in other scenarios, but in a deep philosophical sense, it's all one and the same thing. And so what I was hoping to ask you guys is whether you have any sort of heuristics about when you use that model and when you don't. For the most, so often it will be obvious, but it won't always be obvious. So I guess my meta-criticism is like, I'm not saying that you guys say Bayesianism is totally stupid or whatever, but they are right that it is true in some sense, right? Even if they are misapplying it a lot of the time. How would you think about where to draw that line or when it's a good idea to use it and when it's not? Because unfortunately, we do live in a fallible world and we never actually get any hard numbers about anything. We're all observations are theory bound, right? This is all the stuff from Deutsch and from Popper, which maps extremely well onto the rationalist school of thought as well. It's the exact kind of thing that they talk about.
So I think this just conflates models and assumptions in some sense. So let me maybe wade into this extended thought experiment that you've laid out. So maybe we have a situation where we're trying to reason about a bednet intervention. Suppose we have no data, and then you just have people like Scott Alexander making belief scores and putting credences on whether it's going to help kids in Africa. Okay. Then say you have a number, you have one data point. So you've given it to one kid in Africa. And then, maybe, so that's a separate world. And then in world 2, you have 2 data points. In world 3, you have 3 data points. In world n, you have n data points, right? And I think your point is like, look, this is all sort of on a sliding scale with one another. You're at in the first world, you just have people's beliefs about these interventions, no data. And then at world 10,000, you have 10,000 data points, which is hopefully enough to make a very sound statistical decision. It doesn't seem reasonable to say that at some world K that we don't have enough information to make any decision, and it's all Bayesianism and it's all stupid. And then at world K+1, all of a sudden we have one more data point, and now we're on sound statistical ground. So is that, let me just pause and say, is that sort of getting at the heart of your question here?
Yes, absolutely. Yep, that's a nice way of putting it.
And then I would just say, no. So what's going on is that in each of these worlds, you have some problem to solve. Namely, you're trying to figure out the effectiveness of this intervention, and you are dealing with some statistical model that you're trying to project to solve this problem. Each of these is working with like some amount of data or no data. There's no reason to step back and start putting credences on the models themselves. Which model we use and whether we have a sufficient amount of data is just a matter for debate among statisticians and the public about, is this model good enough for solving this particular problem at hand? It's not probabilities all the way down. The way we reason about which statistical model to use is not a matter for numbers. It's just a matter for argument and debate in the way we'd resolve any other question, right? So it's a problem to be resolved outside of the framework of statistics. And so I think you're confusing like use of the model itself to try and answer a question about the effectiveness of various interventions with the question of arguing about which model to use, which is sort of a question outside of statistics.
Yeah, I think I disagree. I'll just try and quickly go back to my Laplace's demon type argument to see if that can help to sort of pump intuition, which is that, so you guys don't accept that if in fact you did have a lot of information about everything because you're a very knowledgeable being, that Bayes' theorem would in fact be the correct way to arbitrate between competing theories, and that it's not related to a narrow subset of problems. It, in some deep technical sense, could be used to solve all problems, except that in the annoying, stupid real world that we live in, it can't do that because we're not Laplace's demon and we can't enumerate all the states and so on. So just to be clear, you guys disagree with that. That's kind of what you're saying, right?
So there's a number of things, but just there, how would you use Bayes' theorem to adjudicate between the truth of general relativity and quantum mechanics? Because the evidence for both of these increases daily, right? Every time you use GPS, you get more evidence that Einstein is right, and every time you run another quantum mechanical experiment, you get more evidence that that's right. So your evidence for both hypotheses is going up, but they're mutually exclusive. Bayes' theorem breaks fundamentally there. That would be one example.
Right. So this is a great point, right? So Bayes' theorem cannot possibly tell you what is actually true because either one of those is actually true, or in fact, probably both of them are wrong and some other third thing is true, right?
No, I think Vaden's getting at something deeper, though, which is that evidence doesn't speak for itself, right? So if you look out at the world and see something, if you see the sun rising, that doesn't tell you, there's no number to ascribe to that, right? Like any sort of number you're putting on that is a number that comes out of your own just psychological invention. There's no objective way to just simply quantify, now I'm seeing the sunrise. How much evidence, how strong is the evidence of that in favor of general relativity or quantum mechanics? Because actually, like logically, that should be evidence in favor of both of them, just by how logic works, right? Anyway, but how much evidence, right? So quantifying that is a decision we have to make, and we make that in statistical models all the time, precisely because we simplify a bunch of stuff. But the world doesn't come pre-parceled into observations that come attached with some a priori notion of like this is X amount of evidence in favor of general relativity, right? So you have to make that step as an observer, and so this is why I reject your Laplace's demon argument, because even if you could like think of every proposition that humans might utter in the future and parcel that into your head and separate them all, they don't come attached with probabilities, right? And so that's a step you have to make as an observer.
Like you could run this experiment simply, and then I do want to return to the degree not kind stuff because you said some other things in your question that that I want to explore as well. But just like go open up Excel and then just start writing down all the evidence you see around you for stuff. Like, what are you going to write down? What you write down is going to be dependent upon what you're currently thinking about, what you're interested in. There's no way to chunk, slice, and dice. So before we even get to the question of how do you assign numbers to it, we haven't even answered the question of what do we consider evidence in the first place. Evidence doesn't come parceled up for you. It's entirely dependent upon the problem you have in mind, what you're looking for, what questions you're asking. The evidence for Newtonian mechanics was as rock solid as it possibly could be, up until the point that someone had an idea to look for a little piece of starlight behind a solar eclipse, right? How did we even think to come up with that evidence? It's like, so the world doesn't come just with bundles of evidence coming at you, as Bayes' theorem would require it to.
Yeah.
And then even if it did, then you have the second question or the second problem, which Ben just highlighted. Well, how much do you assign to this? How much do you assign to that?
Rich, you can respond, but there's 2 points I want to make to just add on top of that. I don't know if you want to respond first, and then I'll come back to it, but I just wanted to flag that I have some other things to say there.
Okay, just very quick reaction then is that's a helpful way of putting it, and I agree with that. I think I understand what you guys are getting at now, that when you were in the Newtonian mechanics paradigm, it's not like there was some evidence for quantum mechanics that you had to assign weight to. It just hadn't been conceived of. So I think the way
where to look, right?
Yeah.
Like,
so I think
evidence follows from the theory. It doesn't precede the theory, and that's the exact opposite mistake that Bayes makes. Because
I agree with that. Yeah. And I'm not trying to argue that. So, but Benny, do you want to say your piece?
The first is just like a cheeky little thing to say that Cox's theorems, which is used by Bayesians to try and cash all this stuff out, fails precisely when you try and bundle the infinity of propositions and start reasoning about them, because just for technical reasons, it assumes that all these measures, these probability measures that you're using, are what's called like finitely additive instead of countably additive. And countably additive is a property of infinite sets. And so in your thought experiment, you have to be reasoning about infinitely many things, putting aside whether it's countable or not for the mathematically inclined listener. But Cox's theorem actually doesn't handle countability. It only allows for finite additivity. So even if you were convinced by your thought experiment and tried to apply Cox's theorems to rescue Bayesianism, it would fail just mathematically. So that's just a technical point that is not worth going into. But I just think it's this funny. It's this irony that, like, in the precise situation where Bayesianism is like at its peak, like assign everything value, that's when Cox's theorem breaks down. The second thing is
cool
this. I know. Yeah, good thing this is a Patreon.
I have no idea of what you just said. Yeah,
I got you.
Yeah. So Vaden, as long as Vaden's nodding, then I'm happy. You know, I'm impressing Vaden. That's all it's about.
You're always impressing me, Ben. You're always impressing me.
The second thing is just this point about evidence is like quite a deep point. More specifically, this question of like what counts as evidence for something. Because if you have a theory that says, so Newtonian mechanics says like, if Newtonian mechanics is true, then this rock will fall at 9.81 meters per second squared at ocean level or whatever. Mm-hmm. If you take the converse of that statement, says if this rock's not falling at 9.81 meters per second squared, then Newtonian mechanics is false. Does that mean that everything you see that is not a rock falling at 9.81 meters per second squared counts as evidence against Newtonian mechanics? And so this is just a problem, not a problem. This is just a feature of logic. And so everything that you see that actually doesn't directly bear on the theory actually is evidence for or against the theory. And so you'd also have to account all of these observations. You'd have to take these all into account. Like literally everything you're seeing does bear on the truth of the theory. And so you'd have to quantify just everything you're seeing all the time.
Yeah,
not
I agree,
just like we go to the lab and start measuring whether rocks fall. So this is like a pretty fundamental issue with thinking about evidence, quantifying evidence in this way.
Yeah. Let me just react to that, and then we can go back to the degree not kind thing. So Yeah, I agree. Like, this is part of the reason why you have to invoke some kind of daemon, because not only do they have to run the numbers, they have to be constantly recomputing the numbers in real time. It's completely unworkable. So the classical versus quantum mechanics example is really nice and maybe will help to understand what we're talking about here. So yes, at the time when Newtonian mechanics was the paradigm and no one had conceived of quantum mechanics.
Just to clarify, it was a discovery of Einstein's general relativity, which allowed us to say that Newtonian mechanics was false. It wasn't quantum mechanics that allowed us to say Newtonian mechanics.
Yeah, so, okay. At the time when everyone thought Newtonian mechanics was correct, because general relativity had not yet been conceived of, it would have been wrong for people to say, the way that the Bayesians would handle it is, obviously they can't conceive of, they don't have evidence of things that they don't have evidence of, right, as you've pointed out. So I'm not trying to argue that, and that's exactly where I think the Popperian Deutsch gives such a much better view of a much fuller, correct epistemology of where knowledge comes from. Another way of putting this is that to the extent that rationalists or Bayesians are saying that their credences are actual ontological claims about the world, they are wrong. They are claims about their subjective beliefs, right? That's a very important point. And if they are confusing those two things, then they're wrong about that. But I want to we should critique the actual strongest version of that, and smart Bayesians are not making that. They're not making that confusion, right? They don't have that confusion. So in the world where general relativity hasn't been proposed yet, the Bayesians will say something like, oh, there's a 99.9, my subjective credence is a 99.9% or 99% credence in that Newtonian mechanics is correct, and they leave a little error bar because they are fallibilists, just like the crit rats, and they preach that there's no such thing as probabilities of 0 and 1. They could possibly even bring base rates into it and say, look, we had geocentrism before we had heliocentrism. We can have models that keep getting better and better. It's possible that this model will keep getting better and better. They could formalize it in some way. But the point is, the credence that they assign to Newtonian mechanics being true is just a way of making decisions within that world that they happen to live in, the same way that right now we assume that some synthesis of quantum mechanics and general relativity is true, and we make decisions accordingly, including using GPS and all this kind of stuff and lasers and blah, blah, blah. It's not a truth claim about underlying reality, and the reason that it is sort of fundamentally missing the point, and on which I agree with you guys, is that it fails to shift the focus to the new theory. And once you have the new theory, you can then assess the evidence accordingly. So I think we're kind of talking about different things. Like, the way that this is sometimes put is that Bayesianism is abductive reasoning. So it's like a different class of reasoning. It is truly epistemological, not ontological. So it's about where you should assign your probabilities and beliefs, which, by the way, you have to do implicitly or explicitly. You have to take action in the world. It doesn't tell you what is correct, and no serious person who understands this would ever say that it does, right? Like, they would stress all of this stuff. And so if you're in Newton's world, you're not wrong to act as if Newtonian mechanics is true. Put it that way.
I think that one of the major mistakes that the Bayesian less wrong people make, that Popper has pointed out, because this has been a mistake that's been made for the 100 years, basically, is failing to sharply distinguish between truth on one hand and certainty on the other hand. So we have truth and we have certainty. Certainty, I'm happy to describe as a sliding scale that can increase and decrease. But truth is a binary. Something's either true or false. Why this is important is because I don't care about how certain or how... So I'm certain that Newtonian mechanic is false. So I would assign a probability of that to 0. But it's true to say that it is a good approximation of what is true, and thus should be used when you're not dealing with speeds close to the speed of light or whatever. But the truth-certainty distinction I claim is not sharply made in the sense that you're saying, because when people talk about P-doom, right, the whole point of less wrong is that if you think hard enough and if you're rational enough, then your internal certainty radar will track truth in this way. And so when you say that when Toby Ord says that the probability of AGI killing everybody is like 1 in 10 or 1 in 6 or what have you, he's not making that distinction. So what does he mean when he says that? So he's both certain of the truth of the proposition, and that's where things get hyper muddy. When you ask, like, what would Bayesians do? I love the very simple thought experiment, or half joke but half thought experiment that Ben raised in like one of our early episodes about like a crit rat and a Bayesian walk into a bar, and they're both having to decide if the cute girl at the end of the bar is into them. Ben, you remember this thing he said? And the Bayesian spends all of their time weighing up the evidence and looking at the base rates and trying to decide how certain they are that the chick is into him. And then the crit rat just says, well, I'm just going to go up and talk to her and just run the experiment. Because from the critical rationalist perspective, what's important isn't how much you believe something, it's what is actually true. And so when you shift your focus into truth claims and you think about truth not as a sliding scale, but as a binary, then your approach to the world is fundamentally different.
So now we're moving on from the actual sort of technical underpinnings, and we're talking about like the cultural practices associated with.
In my head, they're all the same. So I don't want an epistemology that only works in theory or doesn't map on descriptively to reality or doesn't offer me prescriptive advice. I think if it's a true epistemology, it should be entirely unified. So yeah, we can move on to a different aspect of the conversation, but from my perspective, it's all essentially one and the same. But this like sliding scale thing and this certainty thing. So certainty is a deep part of the human experience, and it is worthwhile talking about. Absolutely. It's just not the main thing that I care about. I don't like Newton. I've said this in the past, but Newton, upon his deathbed, could have recanted everything he ever written and said he doesn't believe any of it, and he's certain that it's all false. But that doesn't matter, because we can think about the truth claims independently of the mind that's produced them, right? Certainty, we only ever can get enough certainty as to progress to the next problem. Certainty is a continuous phenomenon. We'll never be absolutely certain of anything. The example that Popper has used is, I think the literal example is, how many fingers do you have on your hands? Well, if there's no stakes, then I'm going to say I have 10, and I'm not even going to check because I'm certain enough because the stakes are so low. But if I say, well, if you get it wrong, I'm going to kill you and your family, then I'm going to probably pause for a second and just make sure that something hasn't happened, because now the problem situation is much more elevated, and thus the amount of certainty I need to act is much more elevated as well. And so certainty is important. It's just not the central target of epistemology or of truth or of science or of what we're all doing here. We care about truth, and truth is not on a sliding scale. Truth it's either true or it's false, and we will never be certain of that. Another example I've used is I could print off the numbers between 1 and 100 trillion and say there's 1 tree on the planet, there's 2 trees on the planet, there's 3 trees on the planet. One of those statements will be true. But I will never be certain of which one that is. And I can kind of hone in a little bit. But the reason why this matters is depending on the stakes at hand, my amount of certainty I will need to proceed and act will shift. But I just think that if we fail to distinguish between that which is true and that which is false, and how certain we are of the propositions, then everything gets completely muddy, and that's where you get long-termism, and that's where you get this AGI doom and gloom stuff. Because when you talk about the probability of superintelligence being whatever, where is the distinction there? So they're making an implicit truth claim, and their truth claim is predicated on the certainty of the experts who are making such statements, right? And so maybe I'll pause there because that was a lot, but I just wanted to say that I think that the question that you had asked is confusing, or at least failing to sharply distinguish between these things, and that is a direct consequence of Bayesian epistemology, which doesn't. It says that as your belief about something gets higher and higher, why is it getting higher and higher? Because you're more and more confident that it's true. And in that failure to distinguish, I think so much confusion arises.
Yeah, I can't tell how much disagreement there is here. I think, Rich, you also want to say, yeah, of course, there's a difference between truth and credence, and hence that's the whole project of Bayesian epistemology, which is trying and separate those things and try and attack reasoning about the world separately from what's true about the world. And, ideally our credences have these sort of frequentist properties of being correct on average over time, but that doesn't bear on the question of whether they're correct. If I say some proposition is true with 80% certainty, that doesn't bear on whether it's actually true or false in that case. And in particular, it doesn't require that I adopt some fuzzy notion of truth where things are either not true or false. And, you were both not disputing that. But I think, the core of what Vaden is perhaps getting at, and that I would agree with, is that people, by reasoning about the world in this way, are tempted to forget that these credences don't perfectly track reality, and they start overusing them, right? So they start feeding them into their decision-making procedures and they act in the world as if these credences were tracking reality. And so in this way, the distinction sort of collapses, right? And then you get people reasoning about, robot armies taking over the world in 1,000 years or whatever. This is not a joke, right? We discussed this before. These are literal scenarios contemplated by the long-termists and stuff, and people suggesting we, bomb data centers, etc. Still unclear how
he was strategically ambiguous with that.
Yeah. How serious he was being about that, but certainly his acolytes, some of them at least, took those sorts of statements seriously, right? And now we have a roving army of Bayesian rationalists on Twitter shouting their P-doom numbers at one another. And yes, if you back them into a corner and say there is a difference between certainty and truth, they will of course say yes, and reasoning about credences and trying to come up with more accurate credences is dealing with the former and not the latter. So it's a tool to hone our certainty more closely to the world. But you can, you can get drunk on your own credences, as I think Vaden said in the previous episode, which is a great line and is perfectly encapsulates all the problems with this sort of stuff.
Can I add one thing, Rich, before you respond? So in mathematics, if I show Ben a proof, and Ben would be showing me the proof because I can't do proofs, but and then Ben spots an error in it, we don't reduce our credence in this proposition. We don't say, okay, well, maybe it's less likely or it's false. It's true or it's false. That the thing that we're striving for may be true, and there may be a different proof that you can use to get there. But in that instance, it's false. When I read about the now tragically overused disproof of the ability to predict a future when the future is conditional on the growth of human knowledge, that to me was definitive. It was over. The long-termist project was over, because that was as if I showed Ben a proof and he spotted a flaw. But from the Bayesians and from the reaction from the EA forum, they just slightly lowered their credence about it a little bit, because they don't think of truth as a binary, which is what mathematicians do and which is what scientists should do, and how we should be thinking about something. When there's a fundamental flaw, it's over. But if you think about truth as this continuously sliding scale, then that proof is just another slow little snowflake of evidence that will slightly shift your mind ever so slightly about what you think. And you're never able to make definitive, okay, that's wrong, let's go to the next stage. You're only ever slightly moving your mind a little bit, right?
Yeah. So I'm just trying to think of the most fruitful way to take this, because possibly we're somewhat at risk of repeating ourselves. So I think what you guys have been getting into is really what happens when you do Bayes wrong, basically. And therefore I agree with what you're saying. Like,
but we're also saying there's no way to do Bayes right, though. We're also saying there's no way to do Bayes right.
Yeah.
Clear.
Yeah. No, I accept that. But the how to do Bayes wrong stuff is like, yeah, I agree. And that's kind of like not what I'm interested in defending. So I'll just sum up my full theory of epistemology, which is that new knowledge comes from explanations and conjecture that's subjected to criticism. So 100% cosign on the Popper school. Unfortunately, because we are fallible, yes, actual reality is true or false. There is a real answer out there, but we never ever have direct access to it. We can be extremely confident about things, but I'm making this very boring technical point, okay, which is just that all we ever have is beliefs. We don't have, there is no category of certainty. From the point of view of the universe, there is. From the point of view of humans, there isn't. And we've known this from like, you know, Hume and Descartes and all the way back. Like, this is simply something that is not accessible to us. And so the point that I'm trying to make is like, I think a really narrow technical point, which is that in a very deep sense, all we have is beliefs about the state of the world. We're constantly navigating uncertainty, and there is no actual distinction between what in maths or certain branches of statistics is called risk and uncertainty. It's uncertainty all the way down. Nothing is actually quantifiable or modelable with perfect accuracy. And so in an idealized world, Bayes doesn't tell you what's true, but it tells you about how you might assign probabilities to the competing theories for which you are uncertain. And it's bad to focus too much on that for all the reasons that we've given in this conversation and before, which is that it doesn't actually get at the source of knowledge, and it can't possibly conceive of things which you don't input into the equation, i.e. new explanations. But it's not incompatible with it. It's just there is a synthesis there.
May I disagree?
What? I thought I had you there.
Yeah. What you just said is exactly why I was trying to distinguish between truth and certainty. So you're absolutely right that we will never have absolute certainty. Take the most fundamental...
What is a truth? Tell me what a truth is. For example, because in your example, you said that Newtonian mechanics is false, but that's not a truth because, in fact, it could be true.
Water's comprised of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen.
Okay, and why do you think that is justified as a truth? So, can you conceive of a way in which that could be false?
Absolutely. So there's the truth claim, and then there's the certainty dimension. And so for any truth claim, you will never be 100% certain. So could there be some new experiment that disproves that or shows that's wrong? Absolutely. My point about the hand example was that we don't need to fetishize our uncertainty. We don't need to obsess about perfectly quantifying it. We just need to be certain enough to move on to the next frontier. We're just going to say, you know what? I'm just going to assume that's fine for now. I could be wrong. And if in the future there's some theory or some idea that makes us have to revisit that, then let's do it, boys. Let's go and revisit that. But for now, I'm just happy to say I'm certain enough that that's true enough. That's like asking me how many fingers I have in my hand and there's not a gun pointed to my head. And so I'm just going to say it's true. Let's go. Let's go to the next thing now.
Yeah, obviously. But like, how is that different to what I'm saying? Like, I don't disagree with that.
The emphasis is not on quantifying the absolute amount of certainty I have on the proposition that water is comprised of 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. I just say, yeah, good enough. Let's go to the next thing. So I'm not mathematizing it, and I'm also not focusing on quantifying my certainty or uncertainty about that proposition, because the amount of certainty you need is always problem dependent. It's situational. It will change depending on the circumstances and depending on the new kinds of ideas and conversations that we're having at the time. But Bayesian epistemology doesn't get that. Bayesian epistemology says that there is some absolute number out there that say the probability that water is blah, 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 blah is 99 point da, 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 and that's fixed and immutable forever.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. You're misunderstanding like what Bayesian epistemology is. I think you just don't get what it is. It's not an ontological thing. It's about how a rational actor, leaving that problem aside, should go about updating their beliefs on the basis of evidence. They're subjective beliefs. If people say otherwise, they're misspeaking. And sure, we conflate these things all the time. But like that's fundamentally what it is. And that is not incompatible with any of what you're saying about like obviously we shouldn't be relitigating whether water is composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom.
No, but you made my point there, right? Because when you say Bayesian epistemology is all about how do we rationally update our beliefs, and my point was Bayesian epistemology focuses way too much on beliefs and certainty and way too little on truth and fact.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I even said that my beef with Bayesianism is that the emphasis is wrong. The emphasis should be on the Popperian stuff because that's where the good shit comes from, right? That's where the new ideas come from. And as we've discussed, actually doing Bayesian numbers just doesn't really work very well for most problems. So like I'm saying that as well. The emphasis is wrong, but it's not technically wrong. It's true in some deep, boring, very narrow sense. And the reason why Scott has on his blog, P, A depending on B, blah, 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 all the rest is commentary, is like, he is right about that in a very boring, deep, technical sense. It's just that it's kind of the wrong thing to build your movement around.
What do you think the word epistemology is trying to get at then? Like, why not just Bayesian belief updating?
Well, that's a boring argument too. Who cares what you call it, right? We're criticizing like a set of ideas. Like, it doesn't matter. And I don't even know if they call it Bayesian epistemology or whatever, but like epistemology doesn't have to mean one thing. It's like, we could say, what is knowledge? Where does it come from? What are its limits? Why do people have it and animals don't? All this, like, there's a lot of subsets within epistemology that we could talk about.
Ben, you should probably break us up. But let me just say one last tiny point, which is that the Bayesian epistemologists think that the best way to figure out what is true is to focus on their beliefs. That's why the concatenation of those two words. And that's why they deal with hypothesis testing and assigning evidence and et cetera, et cetera. It's because the way that they think they'll get to truth is via this certainty route. And I'm saying no. And you're saying, dude, you're just making a category error. It's Bayesian epistemology is just about beliefs. And why are you assuming it's all about this truth thing? Because they're upfront about the fact that it's just about the beliefs. And I'm saying they're not saying that. They are absolutely making the claim that the best way to figure out what is freaking true about the world is by closing their eyes and thinking really, really, really hard, rather than coming up with ideas and experimenting and but maybe I'll pause there, and maybe Ben should
hold on. Just let me say one quick thing and then go to Ben. So let's zoom in on that sentence. The Bayesians think that the best way to find out what is true is to, run Bayes' theorem, right? So that perfectly gets at the distinction. I think I agree with you that that's what they think, or perhaps many of them think, and that they're wrong about that. But if you reframed it very slightly to the way that Bayesians think is the correct way to arbitrate between competing theories about the world, that, just a slight reframing is Bayes' theorem, I would think that they're correct. So this is my point about how they're emphasizing the wrong thing and sort of fetishizing this process, which isn't very useful. But in fact, in the boring, optimal Laplace's demon sense, yes, Bayes' theorem would be the correct way to decide how to assign credences between competing theories while telling you nothing about the actual truth, which might be some other theory that hasn't been conceived of. And that's why it's not maybe a bit of a dead end or not the most fruitful approach. Ben.
Well, I would just like to now. So Rich, I understand your criticism of Vaden's position, which I think I disagree with, but that's okay. But
you disagree with my position? Or?
No, I disagree with Rich's critiques, I suppose.
Yeah, you hear that, Rich? You hear that?
What the? That's it. You're kicked off the pod. Wait, this was Vaden's plan all along to drive a wedge between us. He's trying to sabotage the pod.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I'm extremely curious what you mean when you say Bayesian epistemology is the correct way to reason. So what we've established so far is you think that it's not even trying to get at truth claims, apparently. Okay, so it's not an epistemology at all. So it has nothing to do with truth. Okay, step one. So step two, I guess it just has to do with quantifying my own belief.
Yes, and doing it in a consistent way.
Okay, so already you're adopting certain axioms of how I should believe things. So one, correctness sort of begs the question there. Two, I guess you're putting aside the issues Vaden and I raised earlier that evidence doesn't speak for itself. So inherently there's some notion of subjectivity here, which I don't know how you get around. Three,
you're ignoring the fact that it's correct with respect to the circular definition of what a quote rational agent would be. So it's a circular definition of correctness. But sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Can I? Yeah, you continue, and I'll try a new approach.
So my perhaps understanding of your position is look, this thing is just instrumentally valuable for reasoning about the world. and doing things and being agentic and trying to have beliefs that have certain properties.
No, that's the exact opposite of what I believe. I believe it's instrumentally almost useless.
Well, what the fuck is it? Okay, so it's not epistemologically valuable insofar as getting at truth. Yeah, so I mean, so it's not instrumentally useful or objectively true.
From the point of view of the universe, if you could do all the things that we can't do to be able to run Bayes' theorem in such a way that it would be useful, then that would be the optimal way to condition.
Dude, this thought experiment has got to stop. Like, one, I think we've shown that this is just not possible. And two, arguing about like what Laplace's demon would do in a perfect world, like that's an insane way to reason about rationality. Like let's end this branch because it's boring to keep talking about it. Like, I don't even care about this. Let me try one last different, like, not a thought experiment, but like an intuition pump. So what sort of meta ethics do you guys have, for instance? Like, do you subscribe broadly to consequentialism or deontology or virtue ethics?
I fucking hate meta ethics.
Vaden's a consequentialist.
I'm a consequentialist, but consequentialism isn't meta ethics. That's just ethics. Sure. But
right, sorry, yeah. Okay, and Benny, do you lean more towards consequentialism? Yeah, me too. Right, so okay, that's good. But so I think if you pushed me, I'd say that I think something like utilitarianism is true, and that specifically hedonic utilitarianism, in the sense of, if you could net up all the positive qualia and net of the negative qualia, then that would be the way to maximize utility in the world.
If you're going to use this as a metaphor, good luck.
Okay, I'll keep it quick. So what I'm trying to get at is utilitarianism is, for all intents and purposes, hedonic utilitarianism is a non-starter. We can't access qualia. We can't measure hedons. We don't know whether they are commensurable. We don't know how to like cardinalize them. We're not going to actually get very far with it when we try and operationalize it. But it is, in some deep sense, I think, true, and we could still use it as sort of a figurehead for the way that we try and act and be in the world. Maybe sometimes we can do rough approximations of utilitarian calculus, even though we know that they'll be wrong, that they could lead us astray, and that they not the best model for every circumstance. I find that exactly analogous to Bayes' theorem, and I see it on Scott's blog as like a figurehead, in the same way that we started this conversation about, of what would theoretically be the correct way to update your beliefs. In practice, it's more like an aspirational thing, and basically no one does it, and when they do it, it looks kind of silly, right? So does that help at all to see where I'm coming from?
It does kind of. So maybe the way I could, tell me if you agree, like if you really want to use Bayes' theorem as like a North Star about how you should change your beliefs, then I would just circle back to kind of how I started, which is Julia Galef does a decent enough job of that. I don't think it makes sense to talk about, quote, the correct way to update your beliefs. I don't know if you read my piece, just shitting all over Mr. Yukowski's claims about laws of rationality and formal correctness and stuff. But I think that's all just complete bunk. But yeah, as a North Star, I'll just say use Bayes' theorem as a way to remind yourself to keep an open mind and to change your mind when new evidence is presented to you. But if that's what you want, Popper just gives you a much better version of that. Because the way that I change my mind isn't seeking out evidence to support my beliefs, which is what Bayes' theorem requires you do. It's seeking out evidence to challenge my beliefs. It's talking to people about my beliefs and trying as hard as possible to find evidence that cuts against my worldview. And you can for sure twist and mutate Bayes' theorem and arrive at some sort of position that gets you there, and that's Galef, and that's all fine and good and dandy. But there, if it requires you to say things like assuming Laplace's demon exists and is possible, like, you don't need any of that. You don't need any of that shit. You can just get it directly from Popper, and that's why Popper doesn't talk about correctly updating your beliefs in accordance with a set of axioms. He talks about conversation styles and attitudes, and that gets you all of the Galef plus all this extra stuff. And you don't need to be saying crazy things about predicating your epistemology and your worldview on Laplace's demon. as a means of being rational. It's fundamentally irrational to predicate yourself on something, predicate your worldview on something which cannot exist and which is literally called a demon. And if that's how you're getting rationality, then there's something flawed in your reasoning.
What credence do you put on your belief about that?
But like, what does it even mean to talk about correct beliefs? When you say that, you're unfortunately just using Yudkowsky's language. But if you follow the citation trail, correctness means in accordance with Cox's theorems, which Ben and I have already talked about, don't apply. And so it's incorrect by definition because it doesn't apply. And so that would be my burst.
I think I'll leave it there. It'll be interesting to re-listen to the conversation and see if I can get some distance from it, and I'll give you my feedback. But I mean, one very small thing I'd say is that we already mentioned on the Discord, and maybe we can end on a very small win for me, is that if you, like, in your episode, you sometimes said things like the Bayesians are just like going with their gut, and Scott could replace his blog posts with the title and then a number if that's what he truly believed in. And my pushback there was just that, like, that's not how Bayesians do it. They absolutely are interested in arguments and so on, and that's how they get their numbers. And it's not their whole thing is that the gut number is your prior, right? That's the gut. And then what you do is you go out and find new evidence, again, similar to what you're saying about you go and talk to the girl at the bar, and then you condition on your you condition on your prior. So, like, just a little thing about, and it's more like, as I said on the Discord, somewhat of a note on PR or something. Then I'm not here to tone police you guys, but that is factually wrong.
And we need it probably.
Well, I would like to see more overlap. Maybe we can end there, because the pop Bayesianism stuff, as it's called, is actually really good. And because we're so deep in this world that it seems incredibly obvious to us to think that you could be less than maximally certain about any given proposition, that either something is wrong or it's right, or that when someone asks you, what do you think about this, you just regurgitate your cached answer without actually thinking about it clearly, and then you anchor on that and are unwilling to change your mind when you hear better arguments and so on. And like, so much of what the rationalists are about is stressing this sort of somewhat more grayscale thinking, and just being willing to update on new evidence. Clearly, Bayes' rule is not the actual way to do that, but it's the openness and willingness to change one's mind that is important. And they almost kind of fetishize it, I would say, and it works. It works surprisingly well, because we're just not built to be truth. I mean, we're not built to gravitate towards the truth. We're built to do whatever is like advantageous for us, which might be totally orthogonal to what is true. That's a really hard thing to do, and I think they do it well, even though they run into some major problems. So I think you guys have an important contribution to make in spelling out why it's incoherent to assign probabilities to every possible conceivable silly event, why that's not a good way of making decisions, and similarly just sort of perhaps critiquing changing the focus away from trying to converge on truth by Bayesian theory, which is incorrect, and trying to converge on truth by, conjecture and refutation, or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, and I think people would be receptive to it. At least I definitely was. And you will find that people come in well-trained in some areas, even if you have to stamp certain other types of beliefs out of them. And the fact is that they're winning and you guys aren't. Not that you're responsible for anything, or that you're the face of this movement or anything like that, but like, they have clout, they have lots of people, they have money, they have status, and they get into the ears of people who actually can spread their memes and stuff. So like, I don't know, there is like a mimetic war to be fought here, right?
I mean, just give us time, Rich. Just give us time.
Yeah. No, I'm backing you boys.
I know. Of course, I'm being slightly facetious, but obviously they have a huge influence, and you are totally right that they're winning in a very real sense, and that's why I get so animated about it, right? Because they, it's not that they're winning, it's that they're spreading mass confusion, which is now having serious ramifications. And you just can see it with every other comment on the EA forum. They're so wrapped around the axle with this probability stuff that they're completely confused. And it's sad to see.
do you think like net negative kind of confusion, or it's still good in some sense that they are taking people who don't think about things probabilistically and giving them certain tools for trying to think clearly and trying to evaluate arguments and so on?
I don't think that throwing probability at people allows them to think clearly. I think it makes them think much less clearly. I think that the good that they have done is quickly dwindling, and part of the piece that I'm writing was just looking at the you just look at all the grants that are being given by EA in the last couple of years, and all of the human development stuff is like gone. It's all buying laptops for AI researchers at Miri and shit. And you can just see this. It's just yeah.
The cat girl budget's out of control.
Yeah. And like, and whether or not they're winning, like that remains to be seen, because I think they are losing face pretty significantly. And if they don't course correct, I don't know how much their reputation, much more brand damage they can take.
Oh, yeah. That's the least of EA's problems, man. Like fucking Sam Bankman-Fried and Bostrom saying racist shit. And that's the least of their problems.
But with regards to the tone, like that, as you know, is a forever problem of mine. If you think my tone is bad now, just
read the initial drafts of his blog post.
Just be thankful that Ben sees the first 3 or 4 drafts of them, and it just takes the tone down. But I am genuinely mad about this. I would be lying if I said I wasn't mad. Yeah, it does bother me. But part of the tone is a genuine reflection of how I feel about the issue. But there's another gentleman in the Discord who's basically taken all of the stuff that I had put out about poverty of long-termism and has rewritten it in a very GPI-friendly caveat kind of way. And so hopefully people who are much more gentle can take these ideas and put their own gloss and spin on them, because we're just trying to get them out there, and then other people can soften it. So,
and you were very gentle with me, which I appreciate. I feel you kept the kid gloves on somewhat.
Yeah, no, this was a great chat. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Super fun.
Whatever anyone concludes, hopefully if they have any confusion around these things, they'll find it either somewhat illuminating or even more confusing.
Spreading our own brand of confusion to combat the probabilistic confusion.
Yeah. You just got to suck them into interminable debates about things, but on this Discord, not on their Discord.
But you should plug the podcast that you've started with my partner. That's okay. I'm not jealous, but tell people where to find you.
Cool. Yeah. So my big claim to fame is that I am the host of one of the top 2 podcasts co-hosted by Ben Chugg. I'm not going to say whether it's number 1 or number 2, but we all know. We don't need to say it. So, we've been doing a book club with our other friend Cam for about a year, actually. And we just started recording our discussions, and then I realized I thought it would be low marginal effort to upload them. It was not low marginal effort, but it's actually really fun. We've been doing Dostoevsky, David Foster Wallace, Nabokov, trying to tackle books that are difficult to read by yourself and benefit from batting the ideas around. And also we just we often we don't do it on purpose, but we often end up taking a Deutschian or Popperian lens on things, or we talk about epistemology or just the kind of geeky things that we happen to be into. So I guess that's our little our point of difference. Check that out. It's called Do You Even Lit? So if you go to doyouevenlit.com, it's got all the different, podcast platforms, Spotify, and leave a 5-star review, like and subscribe. Don't look at our YouTube because it's quite embarrassing.
Ours is pitiful too.
Come and check us out. And I will also quickly plug my blog, which is thedeepdish.org. It's been dormant for a while, and I've been reinvigorated to write by you guys in large part, and by Deutsch and by Bruce Nielsen. And I feel like a lot of what Deutsch talks about is actually under-theorized, and also that some crit rat people, as I know that you guys kind of have said this before, are weirdly kind of dick riders and are not that critical of whatever, Daddy Deutsch has to say, kind of thing. And I love the
Rich
guy,
said
but I
it,
just
not us.
Yeah,
Not naming any names.
Come at me. Apart from the increments audience, of course, are marvelous and extremely open-minded. So I want to write about a bunch of stuff like that. And my most recent post, to give a taste, is called Weaponized Autism as the Font of All Human Creativity.
Ooh.
And it's drawing some parallels between like the Deutschian idea of creativity and actually how it manifests perhaps in the genome, and some links to Simon Baron-Cohen's work on systematizing and autism. So that was a fun one. Come and check it out. And invite me back to argue about something else sometime. It'll be fun.
Yeah, you're welcome back at any time for sure.
But this was a blast. Thank you so much for coming on, Mr. Rich.
Thanks,
and we will talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, fellas. See ya.